Okay, and I think we can get started. Great to see everyone saying hello in the chat. Thank you all for joining. So this is the third and final webinar of 3 webinars from the Vacant to Vibrant program with EPA and CCLR, which is the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Today's session is going to be all about funding brownfield revitalization, and we'll talk through identifying funding sources, crafting proposals for those sources, as well as building partnerships to increase the success of your projects. So I like to start these webinars off with a little spiel and kind of a recap. This webinar is brought to you in a sense by the Vacant to Vibrant program, which most of you, or maybe some of you, got acquainted with during our first webinar and our second webinar, but I'll go over the basics of the program again soon for any of you that are joining for the first time. And I also wanted to re-emphasize that our goal here is really to connect with you all, to connect with folks that are new to brownfield reuse. And we hope this webinar series and this webinar is a starting point for a connection with you, and that you'll schedule a meeting with our team to talk through the issues or goals in your communities. We'll be focusing specifically on brownfields funding today, but I also want to emphasize that the Vacant to Vibrant program is really about addressing a wide range of issues or goals that you might be navigating in your communities, with the goal being and the mission being that everyone deserves access to clean air, clean water, and clean land. Each of these realms are really highly connected when we're working on brownfields and assessing and cleaning up land. So for some housekeeping before I get to some of our specific learning objectives for today, we'll have a short survey for you after the webinar. So once this window closes, a survey will pop up, and we'd really appreciate if you fill that survey out with feedback as well as information on it if you'd like us to reach out to you. Your mic is muted because this is a webinar format, but you can still communicate with us and your fellow attendees in the chat as you guys are doing, which is great, as well as in the Q&A box. So please put all your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll answer the questions at the end of this presentation. So as for learning objectives for today's session, in addition to reaching out to us for a one-on-one meeting, as I've been saying throughout this series, that's the goal, we hope that you walk away from today's session with these 4 points. We hope that you understand how brownfields funding from EPA and technical assistance can support your project success. We hope you learn which project activities can be funded under brownfields grant programs, as well as gain skills to start drafting your own applications and planning out your own projects. And of course, to get acquainted with CCLR and EPA as your partners. So also for those of you joining for the first time, I'd love to introduce our team as well as the Center for Creative Land Recycling. So my name is Devin Rainwater. I'm a program manager with CCLR, and I work closely with communities in regions 9 and 10. And I'm actually based in Oakland, California. And this is just a handful of our team at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. We're EPA's technical assistance to brownfields provider for Regions 9 and 10, and we're also partnered with the Region 9 team for the Vacant to Vibrant program. And we work with communities to support their success throughout the land reuse process, anywhere from planning and visioning to identifying and accessing project funds. And this picture also shows a handful of the lovely, that previous picture showed you a handful of the people at CCLR, and this picture shows you some folks at the EPA Region 9 Brownfields team. And so I'd also like to introduce them and introduce Brooklyn and Daniel, who are joining us today to speak, as well as Lisa, who many of you have met, who will be joining us to answer some questions at the end. So Brooklyn, will you introduce yourself, and then Daniel?
Hi, Brooklyn James. I'm on the EP Redine Brownfields team, and I work with communities in Northern California as well as the Central Valley.
And Daniel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Moore. I'm also with Region 9's EPA Brownfields and Land Revitalization Program, and I work primarily with communities in California.
And then Lisa, will you introduce yourself again?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Lisa Hanusiak, and I'm the Regional Brownfields Coordinator, and I manage grants to the state of California and the state of Nevada and the state of Arizona. Glad you're all able to join us this morning.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, and so I'll go into a bit of a recap also about what the Vacant to Vibrant initiative is. This program is special because it is really focused on listening to communities first, listening to your goals. Our overall mission is to connect with you, talk through what you're working on, hear about the issues that you're facing, whether they're focused on land or different programs that you're working on. We want to work with you and talk with you about those. Oftentimes, the goals or issues that you're focused on, whether it's air quality, water quality, things like that, they can often really be tied back to land. And then brownfield resources might be helpful there. We also want to get you a direct connection with EPA and come to feasible solutions together. And in that, our priority is working with communities that have not yet partnered with CCLR or EPA, and really expanding our reach to communities that have projects that can really benefit from the resources that are available. As I said, we ultimately aim to build a lasting connection with you. So meeting with us can be really informal. You don't have to have a specific project or proposal, to pitch to us or anything like that. We really just want to hear what's going on with you and what your goals are. So with that, you can connect with us by scanning this QR code that'll take you right to a scheduler page where you can get a direct link to a spot on EPA's calendar. CCLR will also be in the meeting so that you can talk through your community's goals and priorities. So I'll also put this link in the chat so that everyone can access it throughout the webinar. And then I'll pass it over to Daniel.
Thanks, Devin. So I wanted to start us off by giving audience members a quick refresher on what we mean by brownfields. And I assume most of you already are aware if you attended any of our previous webinars, but if you didn't, essentially brownfield sites are abandoned or blighted properties where the reuse or redevelopment is inhibited by either perceived contamination or known contamination. And the whole mission of EPA's Brownfields program is to provide funding to communities to move these types of properties into productive end uses. So when we think about what is a brownfield, we tend to think about historical uses that ultimately led to that contamination or blight. And this could be past public or commercial uses like abandoned gas stations that may have petroleum contamination, old abandoned schools that may be impacted by lead-based paint or asbestos. We've seen brownfield sites from heavier industrial uses like mining, shipping, even agriculture, which could leave behind things like heavy metals or pesticides. And then even vacant lots can be considered brownfield sites, especially where there may be illegal dumping or perhaps an underground storage tank. So all of these are considered brownfield sites, and it's a very broad definition, so something to keep in mind as we talk about redevelopment and funding sources for redevelopment. Next slide, please. So why does EPA care? Obviously, our mission is to protect human health in the environment, and our goal is to help communities ensure that land is safe to use, but also to put these properties back into productive uses in ways that benefit communities. And those benefits could be a long list of things. So for example, conservation of open space or green space. Maybe you want to restore a brownfield site into a natural habitat or sustainable agriculture. Redevelopment could also include building housing, especially affordable housing is a common end use. We see public parks are another type of reuse that we see on brownfield sites. So all of these are considered end uses that benefit communities, right? Not just in terms of reducing environmental risk, but providing those longer term amenities to a community that improve overall quality of life. And then, of course, doing this type of work has a positive economic impact as well, creating jobs, increases the tax base, and builds community wealth. Next slide, please. All right, so thinking about the whole topic of today's webinar, how do we fund redevelopment? What types of funding sources are available? So the EPA Brownfields program supports a really wide range of activities throughout the redevelopment process. And we accomplish that primarily through grants and technical assistance, which we'll go over today in more detail. But I want to emphasize that the funding is not just about cleaning up sites, but also funding those early stage activities like site identification, assessments, all the way through reuse planning and community engagement. And I think this is what makes brownfields funding such a powerful tool for communities, because you have that flexibility to address each part of the redevelopment process, minus the redevelopment itself. Like our funding is not used to construct housing, for example. But I'm going to provide a brief overview of each of these eligible activities just to give you an idea of what you can do with brownfields funding. Next slide. All right, so the first step in any brownfields project is figuring out which sites to focus on. So our funding can help communities build an inventory of potentially contaminated sites. And those inventories typically include details like past land uses, size, known or suspected contamination issues, and potential for reuse. And obviously communities will often prioritize these sites based on a variety of factors like redevelopment potential, location, community need. For example, that need could be affordable housing if you're in an area with expensive housing. So that's typically the first step in the redevelopment process. Next slide, please. Then we get into doing the more site-specific environmental assessment work. So once the site is identified, the first step is usually to do a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And really the goal of the phase 1 is to review records, inspect the site, talk with stakeholders to identify what those potential contamination or environmental conditions are on the property, which we refer to as RECs, recognized environmental conditions. And the process of doing a phase 1 must follow EPA's all appropriate inquiries rule and ASTM standards. I won't get into too much detail about that today, but the important thing to remember that doing your phase 1 in accordance with those standards is an important part of doing your due diligence prior to taking on any contaminated property, especially if you're planning on acquiring a property. And the phase 1 typically doesn't include sampling. So a phase 1 report will have more information about historical research, identifying potential risks, or maybe even identify a need for further investigation. Next slide. So if a phase 1 identifies concerns around contamination, a phase 2 environmental site assessment is usually the next step. So this is where actual testing and sampling happens, whether that's soil, groundwater, soil gas, all depending on the site. And I do want to point out that brownfields funding can also cover hazardous building material surveys, which are especially important for like older buildings, which usually involves checking for things like asbestos, lead-based paint, or other materials that might pose a risk during redevelopment. And the phase 2 is also a really important step in assessing exposure risks and informing cleanup decisions. So usually the result is a report with very clear data or information about the contamination issues on the site, and then the recommended next steps in terms of mitigating environmental risks. So after the assessment, if cleanup is needed, the next step is usually cleanup planning. So one thing to keep in mind is that we require all EPA-funded brownfields cleanups to produce what we call an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives. And this is essentially a document that evaluates the different cleanup options for remediation, their effectiveness, the costs of those different cleanup options, and then also to allow for community input. And then the cleanup plan, sometimes also referred to as like a remedial action plan or a remedial action work plan, that builds on the information from the APCA by laying out all of the technical details of the chosen cleanup strategy. And I do want to emphasize that when you pursue EPA brownfields funding to do cleanup, we highly encourage communities to do this work with their local or state oversight agency, because those are the agencies that set cleanup standards, since ultimately they'll be the ones overseeing the project and the type of work. And we'll touch more on that in a subsequent slide. So then brownfields funding can also pay for the actual cleanup work, the most expensive part typically. So those activities can include things like soil excavation, if the soil is contaminated and needs to be disposed of offsite, for example. Capping or containment of contamination is another common one, including on-site treatment. Installation of vapor intrusion mitigation systems, that's a common one we see, especially with affordable housing projects. A hazardous building materials abatement is another eligible cleanup cost. And this isn't an exhaustive list. Obviously, cleanups and cleanup technologies extend beyond what's listed here. And again, many of these sites, we will work with the state's voluntary cleanup programs to oversee this type of work, which we ask you to do as part of accessing our funding. So for example, in California, the primary state oversight agency is the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. All right, next slide, please. So now moving beyond the environmental work, brownfields funding can also support a wide range of reuse or redevelopment planning. So this can include things like market analysis, visioning workshops, conceptual site design, infrastructure needs assessment, essentially any early planning tool that will help move the site closer to redevelopment. And the goal here is to help communities and maybe even developers make informed decisions about the future uses of the site, and also to attract that additional funding or investment to actually bring the redevelopment to fruition. So really the purpose of reuse planning is to connect the environmental work like assessment and cleanup with the community's broader redevelopment goals, which is a really big priority in our program. All right, community involvement. So I won't discuss this too much because this was the focus of our last webinar, but I wanted to remind audience members that community involvement is another eligible activity under EPA Brownfields funding, and it's something that is woven throughout every stage of a Brownfields project. So obviously this can include activities like public meetings, surveys, newsletters, translation services, basically any meaningful engagement with residents or stakeholders that are needed to make your project happen. And I will also point out that community engagement is typically a requirement for all of our funding, whether that's with grants or technical assistance. So that gives you an overview of all the eligible activities that we can support through EPA Brownfields funding. And now Brooklyn is going to go over the specific type of funding mechanisms that we offer, so all of our grants and technical assistance.
Thank you, Daniel. Please interrupt me if I'm having any connection issues, and I'll turn my camera off because my Wi-Fi's been kind of weird today. But yeah, like he mentioned, I'm going to go over the different funding mechanisms that we have to do some of these activities that Daniel just talked about. So I have on the screen just like a graphic that has an overview of the different grants that we offer, as well as the technical assistance programs. And like Daniel mentioned, EPA funds the brownfields redevelopment process starting from site identification all the way up until the actual reuse, the actual construction or the redevelopment. So we have different grants that hit on all of these different aspects that you see here. And typically, our notice of funding opportunities for the competitive grants will come out in the September timeframe, but we have been seeing some like delays, so this could change, but this is what we typically see. All right, next slide. Okay, so just the other day, they announced the anticipated offerings for the different grants. So I wanted to throw up this graph here just so you can see what we are anticipating to announce as far as the number of awards and the grant amounts for each of the grant types. And even here, it shows the breakdown between what's going to be funded with the bipartisan infrastructure law versus our regular appropriated funding. And would be a good time to remind you that this will be the last year that the bill funding is going to be a part of these grants. And so that's kind of what's allowed us to offer more grants nationwide as well as higher grant amounts. And so this is the last round of that. All right, next slide. So first, we are going to talk about assessment grants. We have 3 different types of assessment grants that we're going to be offering this round, including the community-wide assessment grant, the assessment coalition grant, and the community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes. I have the funding amounts color coordinated below. So the activities that Daniel talked about as far as brownfields inventories, doing those phase 1 and 2 environmental site assessments, conducting community outreach and engagement, as well as doing your cleanup and redevelopment planning activities can all be funded under these assessment grants. The community-wide assessment grant is aimed, the goal of it is for an entity that will apply to identify a target area in their community where there might be multiple brownfield sites that need this environmental investigation work. For the assessment coalition grant, the idea here is that there's one lead entity that will apply with 2 to 4 non-lead partners, and they will identify a target area that they want to address kind of all together as a group. And the idea behind that is some like more rural communities or smaller organizations might not have the capacity to manage or apply for a grant on their own, and so they can become a partner with maybe a higher capacity organization to still complete this work in their area. And for the states and tribes community-wide assessment grant, same activities apply, but this offers a little bit higher of a funding amount. Slide. Next, I'm going to talk about the grants a little bit more. So under these grants, you can fund the actual remediation of whatever contamination that you've identified through your assessments. Again, it can cover any community involvement or outreach that needs to happen at this stage. It can also cover the regulatory oversight fees and further reuse planning. There's a couple extra requirements that come along with being eligible to apply for these cleanup grants, including that the applicant has to be the sole owner of the site, and that applicant cannot be the responsible party for the contamination on the site. And then that site also has to be fully characterized at the time that you apply, which typically just means that you have a completed phase 2 environmental site assessment. And there's also some requirements about community notification, and I'll go into this a little bit more on another slide, but there needs to be a community meeting that's held 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks before the application is due, to allow for public comment on the cleanup grant application and other documents like the ABCA as well. And so we are anticipating to offer a $500,000 grant and a $4 million grant for the cleanups this year. And like I mentioned about the bill funding, it's a last round, but the bill funding is eliminating the cost share. Next slide. So this round we are offering the multi-purpose grant, which we did not offer last round. And essentially this is a combination of the activities you could do under a cleanup grant and the activities you can do under an assessment grant. But we do ask that if you receive a multi-purpose grant that you plan to complete at least one phase 2 environmental site assessment, one brownfields cleanup, and to develop an overall revitalization plan that has a specific strategy for one or more of the sites that you discuss in your application. So we're offering these up to $1 million, and because of the bill funding, there's no cost share on these grants either. Next slide. I wanted to touch a little bit on the revolving loan fund grant, although it's not going to be offered in fiscal year 2026. Under these grants, the applicant would be able to provide loans and subgrants to perform site remediation. This is one of our only avenues for privately held sites to be cleaned up with our funding because they are eligible for loans under RLFs. And the recipient of this grant must be able to demonstrate that they can administer these loans and manage program income as well. A couple things to note here is that 50% of the funds go to loans and the rest can go to subgrants. And these amounts, at least last year, were $1 million, but you can receive supplemental funding over time. And although they're not going to be offered next round, we typically see them offered every other round. So you might expect to see them offered again in FY27. Okay, next slide. Okay, I wanted to put up this chart just because we've got some feedback in our last webinar that people were curious about, you know, applying for multiple grant types or things that might exclude you from applying. So this chart is a little hard to look at and there's a lot of words, but the biggest takeaway I wanted to highlight here is that you can apply for an assessment grant and a cleanup grant together, or you can hold them both at the same time. But if you apply for a multi-purpose grant and you want to apply for another grant type, you have to draw down at least 70% of that funding and spend it before you can apply for another grant. Okay, next slide. All right, so oh, I saw a question pop up. The last chart was the FY25. We expect it to be pretty similar for FY26. They just haven't released a new chart yet, but we anticipate it to be very similar. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the eligible entities that can apply for our grant types. So on the left there's the list. So it's typically local governments, nonprofits, 501c3, regional councils or groups of local governments, redevelopment agencies, states, federally recognized tribes, and qualified community development entities. If you're not quite sure if you are an eligible entity, you're welcome to reach out to us, schedule a meeting, and we're happy to go over the specifics with you to identify whether or not you'd be eligible to apply for a grant. And a couple other eligibility requirements, more regarding sites in particular, that I wanted to show with up here on the slide. So like I mentioned, the applicant cannot be the responsible party or cannot be liable for the contamination. The site can't be listed on the national priority list, or it can't be Superfund site. So our Brownfields funding cannot address those sites. It's typically not eligible if there's any ongoing court orders on the site, but this can be a little bit nuanced. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out. And I think I mentioned previously for cleanup grants, the applicant has to be the owner of the site, but that's not the case for assessment grants. And then, of course, we want the site to have some sort of reuse potential that's going to benefit the community. Alrighty, next slide. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about our state and tribal response program. You also might have heard it be referred to as the 128A program. This is kind of on a different timeline, a different track than our competitive grants that will be offered in the fall. But this is aimed at helping states and tribes with developing a brownfields program or other basic administrative infrastructures that are needed to do brownfields work, as well as ways to help control illegal dumping situations. It can be used to develop emergency response plans, abating or removing underground storage tanks. We've seen people address methamphetamine cleanups. It can even help with addressing air pollution issues in your community, and then cleaning up and reusing contaminated land. So definitely put the link in the chat for that. And I just wanted to shout out that we have 148 federally recognized tribes in Region 9. All right, next slide. So now I wanted to share a little bit about our Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program. This is a non-competitive program. It's not a grant, but more like technical assistance. And so this is free contractor assistance that can come out and perform your site assessments, your phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, as well as develop an ABCA, which was the analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives that Daniel talked about, the cleanup options and cost estimates report. And they can even help with community outreach regarding this. So this program is available year-round on a rolling basis, and I have a QR code to the application there, and Devin put the link to that as well. So this is typically for, a single site that needs these site assessments completed. It's also a really good way to line up the site to be eligible for a cleanup grant, because it gives you that ABCA and that completed phase 2, which are required for applying for the cleanup grant. And our contractors will come out and do that work for free for communities that are eligible. Okay, next slide. I wanted to briefly show some other EPA programs that are brownfields adjacent and might be useful to your brownfield project. So the first one is Repowering America's Lands. The RE stands for Renewable Energy. And this program helps develop renewable energy projects on brownfields or former brownfields, old landfills and old mine sites and things like that. And they help develop these renewable energy projects to align with the community's vision for the site. They also have a mapper that helps you identify sites that could be potentially good for renewable energy projects like solar farms. And then I also wanted to talk about the underground storage tank program. So they have a database that you can help you find known USTs. They also have other resources for underground storage tank owners with more information on like how corrective actions are taken for any releases or leaking tanks. Okay, next slide. Great resource to tap into is philanthropic funding. So our program only funds up to the actual redevelopment. We don't have funding for the redevelopment itself or construction. So it's great to look for different foundations or resource finances for this construction and redevelopment. They can also help enhance community development efforts that are going on in your community. They can complement public funding and other local initiatives that your community is working on, and a lot of them promote sustainable redevelopment practices. So I have a list of some examples of philanthropic funding that deal with land reuse here on the slide. So if you're interested, you can check out some of these different foundations. Slide. Awesome. I think here's where I'm going to pass it back over to Devin.
Awesome. Thank you, Brooklyn, for all of that wonderful information. I know that Brooklyn and Daniel shared a lot of different information. So all of these slides will be made available to everyone in a follow-up email next week. And I have yet another resource to share with you guys. So I'm going to pop this into the chat so you can check it out as I describe this resource from CCLR. So this is another resource to examine funding sources and plan your project. It's CCLR's guide to creating a park. If you're looking at turning your brownfield site into a park or open space or public playground, these 5 steps can guide you through the process of doing so. I know, as Brooklyn mentioned, EPA only funds up to the actual development and construction of the site. So this Parks Guide gives you some other ideas for funding your park through the development and maintenance of the facility. So that's a great resource to keep in mind. I now want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the value of partnerships within a brownfields project, specifically when accessing funding for your project. So it's very strategic to layer funding sources within your project and throughout it, as well as diversify the expertise on your project team, expand the networks of your team, and therefore build capacity for a stronger and more sustainable project. So I'll go through each of these categories of potential partners. So who are your partners at the federal level? While EPA is a key player and a funder in brownfields work, as we've been learning today, many other federal agencies can also provide a really significant funding for your redevelopment projects. And here are just a few of them. So HUD, or the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, offers community development block grants, also called CDBG, that can support housing, infrastructure, and economic development, and can often be layered or used alongside with EPA grants. The EDA, or the Economic Development Administration, focuses on economic revitalization, funding public infrastructure, and also supporting redevelopment planning. USDA, or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, can play a big role in rural communities with grants and loans for infrastructure, housing, as well as community facilities. And the Department of Transportation can really support you on projects involved in just that: transit, roads, and pedestrian infrastructure. And it's important, it can be really helpful for transit-oriented development, such as revitalizing sites near transit corridors, or even creating or developing a transit center on your brownfield site. And EPA brownfields grants are often a starting point, and these other federal programs can help move projects towards redevelopment. I'd also like to share the Federal Programs Guide, which identifies and explains all federal programs that can support projects at the federal level, including land reuse projects. So I'll put that in there for you guys to check out, it can be a really helpful guide. So who are your state partners? So each state in Region 9 has its own brownfields related programs that can complement your EPA funding. And in some cases, they have additional funding to support assessment or cleanup activities. And reaching out to these agencies, or even reviewing their brownfields programs online to see what's available or what help they can provide, is a really great early step. These entities on this slide are large oversight agencies that you can also reach out to connect you with other agencies that might be more relevant to your specific project. This is kind of looking at the state agencies from a really high level. Who are the big players? But it's important to remember that these players can be your starting point. They can be partners to connect you to a network that can really help you get your project developed. So going through these, the California Department of Toxic Substances Control operates a voluntary cleanup program for brownfields oversight, and they can also help with technical assistance and oversight during the site assessment process. The Arizona Department of Environmental Quality has a brownfields program that provides free assessments and cleanup assistance under their voluntary remediation program. They're an excellent resource, so if you're in Arizona, working with them is wonderful. The Hawaii Department of Health runs their Office of Hazards and Emergency Response, and can also provide guidance on cleanups through their voluntary response program. The Nevada Division of Environmental Protection offers voluntary cleanup oversight as well. And so working with these agencies can help speed up the process, since redevelopment projects often require engagement with your state before breaking ground anyways. So it's really good to be working with them from the start of your project. And local partners can oftentimes be your strongest project champions. Some of the key groups to engage are on this slide. And some of these folks, you can work with throughout the entirety of your project and beyond. So it's really good to be thinking about who you can partner with that are kind of in these categories in your area and related to your project. And again, please reach out to us if you have any questions about engaging with potential partners in your community or in your area or around your project, because we can certainly help you get into contact with potential partners. So looking at these folks, local governments can really play a critical role in brownfields projects, as they control a lot of land use decisions, including zoning, permitting, and they also have incentives such as tax abatements or fee waivers. A lot of cities and counties also use tax increment financing to support their projects. And so if you have more questions on that, you can talk to us. And community-based organizations are also a great bridge to residents. They can help with outreach, building trust, and ensuring that community priorities are incorporated into your redevelopment project, just like we talked a lot about during our last webinar. Regional planning commissions or councils of government are also important partners for larger regional brownfield redevelopment strategies, as they can help align redevelopment with other key goals like transportation, housing, and regional economic plans. This can be a really helpful partner for you to kind of get a bird's eye view of what is going on in your region. And in many cases, tribal governments also lead brownfields work on tribal lands. They may have their own funding sources and regulatory processes, and it's really important to connect with tribal governments as well. So all of these local and regional partners can help you to unlock funding, garner community support, and really lead you towards long-term project success and work with you throughout that success as well, and support you in having a sustainable project. And so brownfields redevelopment really takes a team. It's not something that EPA, let's say, or any single agency can really do alone. It takes a broad coalition of partners. So that's why we're kind of showing you all of the different ways to collaborate with folks that are already doing this work or have a good map of the folks that are doing this work and can help you, can kind of point you in the right direction. So federal, state, and local governments, for example, like we talked about, they all bring different funding sources. They have different access, different regulatory tools, and diverse expertise. Regional entities and private developers can also finance and deliver on projects, and community organizations and residents are really essential for ensuring that redevelopment meets local needs and that you avoid displacement and further down the line, potential gentrification. So ultimately, when all these partners work together, and you can work on pooling funding and resources, you can overcome funding gaps, and also build project momentum when you align redevelopment goals and also have that long-term community trust. It's also really beneficial to understand who's doing the work in your area, in your state already, who already has some EPA program funding that you can partner with. Working with your state agencies can really help you connect with folks like that. And I see also that Jennifer Bailey is putting in some great resources in the chat. Thank you, Jennifer. And then another thing I want to emphasize, of course, is CCLR is your technical assistance provider for Region 9. We've been talking a lot about funding sources, specifically EPA funding, and CCLR can support you in developing your applications for EPA funding. We can review your drafts as many times as you need and also support you in putting together pieces of your narrative. This is all free services. And based on statistics of past years for EPA funding, we can double your chance of receiving an EPA grant in what is often a very competitive application process. And last year, we supported communities in Region 9 and 10 in bringing over $22 million to their regions. So CCLR can be an excellent resource for you and really improve your chances. And here, I won't go into too much depth on our tips for writing a good application, but here's kind of an overview and shows you a little bit about what we can talk about in a meeting with you. These are a few tips that CCLR provides. And we're ready to work one-on-one with you to kind of talk through your application and also review your draft when you have one ready. It's really good to start early, so starting now is not a bad idea at all. And you can look over some of these tips that are also live on our website. You want to make a strong statement at the beginning of your section that's succinct. You want to have it easy to read, provide an enthralling story arc, building out your narrative. And instead of embellishing with flowery language or assumptions, you want to really emphasize facts and statistics are a huge benefit to your application. And you also want to maintain consistency between, for example, your timeline and your budget, as well as your work plan and your budget. All of those things should really align. And of course, get help and have folks like CCLR review your application, but you can also share it with folks in your network, even family members to review it and see if it makes sense. And with all of that, I will also love to invite you all to join us at the California Land Recycling Conference that is happening in Carson, California, September 16th through 18th. So that's in just over 2 months from now. This conference, like I mentioned last time, it has California in the title, but it's really open to all states in Region 9. So we would love to see you all there and connect with us there. And we're going to have a lot of good sessions covering a lot of different topics, all related to land reuse and also a lot of focus on funding. And then also at the California Land Recycling Conference, we will be replicating our event at the National Brownfields Conference called Perfect Pitch, where you can introduce your project to a panel of experts to receive technical assistance, advice from the panel of experts, as well as a chance to win free Brownfield project support and pro bono support. So you can scan the QR code here to learn all about the California Land Recycling Conference, check out the Perfect Pitch event, and register to join us there. And again, I always have to put to kind of give a plug to connecting with us. We are your partners in land reuse. So you can scan this QR code to schedule a meeting with the Vacant to Vibrant team. And like I said, it doesn't have to be a formal pitch or anything like that. You can come talk to us about what you're working on, what you're focused on, what you're hearing from your community. You can talk about what's in your general plan and how you're trying to meet your goals, everything like that. We would love to meet with you. And I'll leave this up on the screen while we can kind of transition to a question and answer portion. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the question and answer box that should be on the little panel on your Zoom. And also let me know if I missed any questions that are in the chat or any comments. I appreciate Jennifer's comment. talking about federal historic rehabilitation tax credits, especially for the remediation of asbestos and lead paint within a historic building. All right, and I'm not seeing any questions. Does our team of speakers have any last minute comments to kind of make a pitch for connecting with us, looking at EPA Brownfield's programs? Brooklyn or Daniel or Lisa, do you want to say anything about the availability of bill funding?
Yeah, I'll just remind people that this is the round that funding's be available for. So if you think you have a brownfields project that you would like to get addressed, this would be a really good time to do it. And sometimes we don't even know what questions to ask yet, or people might still be thinking. That's totally fine. But yeah, please schedule a meeting with us later on if you have those questions. We're happy to walk through and just brainstorm projects with you. Oh, sorry. At the beginning, I said just a reminder that this is going to be the last round of bill funding is for this round FY26. So it's a good time to take advantage of these grants that are going to be offered. And if you're not quite sure if your project would make sense for our program or maybe another, to just schedule a meeting with us and we're happy to discuss. Now, I think I see some questions coming in the chat.
Perfect. Yeah. So Casey asks, do you have examples of communities who have pursued brownfields projects on tax defaulted lots? They'd like to connect with them about Alameda County's work.
Hi, Casey. I can follow up with you separately on that because City of Richmond actually, I think, has experience in doing that. So I can follow up and connect you with them. But there is precedent for it.
Awesome. Kyle asks, often at brownfield sites, there is solid waste along with contaminated soils, etc. Are there any options to use brownfield funding to address this solid waste aspect of site cleanup and reuse?
I've received this question before, and this is especially a problem where there's a lot of illegal dumping. And Lisa, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but our funding can't be used to clean up solid waste. It has to be cleanup of a hazardous substance as defined under CERCLA, which is our statutory authority. That being said, I think there may be cases where if solid waste is getting in the way of doing assessment or cleanup work, where it may be appropriate to use funds to remove that solid waste. But I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't know, Lisa, if you have other thoughts.
Daniel, that's exactly right, that our funding focuses on cleaning up hazardous substances and petroleum, not solid waste. But occasionally there is a need to do some sort of, for example, site preparation, like Daniel mentioned. The thing to keep in mind, though, is if you submit a grant application and it has a large component of the budget devoted to clearing the site, it's not going to be very competitive because the whole goal of our cleanup grants, for example, is to address hazardous substances and petroleum.
But if you do have a site where there is a lot of illegal dumping or solid waste, it doesn't mean that you can't do a phase one or a phase two to understand if there are any contamination issues as a result of the illegal dumping or solid waste.
Awesome. Thank you for those answers. Another question. Are you seeing brownfields funding being used to assess or clean up PFAS contamination? So I'll ask the EPA team if PFAS is one of the contaminants that's covered by brownfield cleanup funding.
I will say that I have worked on assessments where PFAS is a component of some of the testing that's done, and I know that at Brownfield's conferences and meetings, there's more and more talk about PFAS, but I have to say I haven't really overseen a lot of cleanups. And a lot of times the PFAS is in groundwater, which is also something that our program doesn't frequently address because we're really looking at trying to make the site usable based on what's happening in the upper portion of the soil right next to where people might get exposed based on whatever redevelopment or reuse. So it's kind of a lesser evaluation of doing focused work on groundwater. But everything that we do is on a site-specific basis. So if you have specific questions about a PFAS site in mind, um, it wouldn't hurt to just talk with us, and we can discuss options and the situation for the given site. It's hard to answer that question in general. I don't know if Daniel or
Yes.
Brooklyn have anything to add to that.
I haven't had experience directly with sites where they were looking at PFAS, but I do know it is now considered a hazardous substance under CERCLA. So I don't see why it wouldn't be like an eligible type of contaminant to investigate under Brownfield's funding.
Yeah, I know that PFAS has sort of been entering the conversation, and so we're figuring out creative ways to clean it up and include that in EPA Brownfield's purview. So I don't see any more questions, and we're reaching the hour mark, so I can let you guys go a little early. If you have any more questions, please reach out to us. I'll also put our individual contact information here on the screen. Of course, schedule a meeting with us. This is the final Vacant to Vibrant webinar in our 3-webinar series. But it won't be the last time, that we do an event or reach out to you. So you can always find us at different conferences. California Land Recycling Conference coming up. We'll be at the National Brownfields Conference to connect with you, and also, schedule a meeting with us so we can meet you and get this conversation started. Really great to see all of you here today. And thank you all for joining, and thank you to Daniel, Brooklyn, and Lisa for joining as well. And we will send out the recording and slides next week.